anxious for this one. All right, so I'm going to talk about the autobiography of Malcolm X in this one. I just got through with it. I like to listen to audiobooks while I'm at work. It was a must read or must listen. Um, uh, it was a good listen. I learned quite a bit that I did not know. Um, especially relating to the Black community and why and how and why it is where it is today. It's further confirmation on what I had learned outside of uh, this book, and it also gives some insight on into his mind, into Malcolm X's mind, or as we will come to know him as either Detroit Red and Mr. El-Shabazz. So I want to go ahead and jump right into this one because this man, people tend to gravitate towards Martin Luther King. At least that's what society wants you to gravitate to him. But I have always, and I mean always, been on the side of Malcolm X, and also in his later years, Mr. El-Shabazz. I have always been more, how can I say it, favorable to his ideology and what he had learned about how to get things done in society. So let's talk about
Put some respect on my name. You understand me? When y'all saying my name, put some respect on it.
So I'm just going to talk about what I got from the book. No notes, no nothing. I usually do that kind of thing with the dive. I have clips and notes and stuff like that. This is just me talking about the book from my perspective. And one of the things that stood out to me is obviously, it's based off his life and his writings as well, and the notebooks and whatnot. But one of the things, there were a couple things that stood out to me. And the first thing that stood out to me after, taking a step back and looking at the entire autobiography, the obvious thing was the transition of Malcolm's life. And, I'm going to refer to him as Malcolm for now. But the transition of his life from early stages, he talks about how his father was an early supporter and preacher um, of an activist. I can't think of the name right now. I'm having a brain fart. I'm sorry, I'm at work. I'm exhausted and tired. But Marcus Garvey, there we go. He was an early supporter and preacher of Marcus Garvey. Um, Big black man got with a light skinned woman whom his Malcolm's mother, whom had somewhat of a sixth sense, kind of similar to how I kind of use my EQ, my awareness, social awareness. But she had a bit of a sixth sense to her, so she was a bit, uh, I don't want to say psychologically impaired, because I am aware of people that do have that intuitive sense for things, because she actually kind of predicted or had a dream or nightmare about Malcolm's father's death, and he ended up dying that very night. Um, but she was the baby of a, apparently she was her his mother was the baby of a rape from a white man to her mother, and because of that, she somewhat despised herself because she despised the white that was in her, which is why she chose Malcolm's father because she much more preferred dark-skinned men, darker-skinned men. And Malcolm's father was, big, 6 foot something, dark-skinned, man. And he fit the profile. And I believe she had some kids before she got with him. So they ended up having a bunch of other kids, including Malcolm, when she married Malcolm's father. And transitioning from childhood, of course, this once Malcolm's father died, the household, you know, his mother did what she could, but inevitably she had a social break, a mental break, and it took a toll on her. And she spent the rest of her days, I believe, in a mental hospital. Uh, a similar thing would happen to Malcolm's brother as well. So not sure if that ran in the family or not. But Malcolm experienced, a life where they had to hunt for their own food. Especially after their father passed. They had to hunt for squirrels and sell the meat and whatever they didn't sell. I think not squirrels, sorry, rabbits. And of course, eat what they could and make money however they could. And inevitably, they split up the family. The state split up the family. Malcolm was adopted by another family, so he got to see a somewhat better life than the poverty that they were living in. Uh, when they were with his mother and they were struggling. And inevitably, it led him to the life of a hustler. And that eventually he got good. He was in the streets. He was a hustler. He was out there doing what he had to do. He was pretty good at what he was doing, right? And inevitably, it led him to, I believe it was Harlem. When Harlem was popping, it was black. Of course, today it's been gentrified. Harlem's not the same today as it was then, but back then, it led him to the life, his hustling lifestyle. He got into a bit of trouble from time to time. Uh, he did have a record and everything. And this is where he starts to transition, into who he would become known as Detroit Red. So this was him as the hustler. He's out there, you know, doing a bit of devilment, drugs constantly, swindling people for whatever he could, hustling to make a dollar. He did have a job, and he would splurge from time to time, like not too uncommon, like how some young black men do today, unfortunately. Which is why I say there's a lot of stuff that it kind of brings to light that a lot of what we see going on today, they were actually doing back in like the 1930s, right? Because he was able to dodge the war because he was young. He was too young for it. So his story of Detroit Red was around the 1930s, kind of. And then inevitably, he gets mixed up with a white girl. He did dabble with white women. He talks about this. Also, he talks about kind of the underworld, because, like I said, he was in the streets. He was a hustler. And a bit of the underworld was there's two things: the swirlers, where you had white men and white women who would occasionally dabble with black men and black women, either as a fetish and then from the black people's perspective, they saw it as a status. A black man that could pull a white woman, it was more of a status thing, very similar to what's similar today. Especially how people perceive it. If you're a black man, they see it as some type of upper status if you can get with a white woman. Not all, of course, but it is relevant. I am aware of that. And like I said, this is during the 1930s, and he talks about how there was also that swirler culture where they would fetishize and get, occasionally the white women would, even married white women, they would get their black bucks, and have whenever the husbands would go away, then they get their black bucks and have a good old time when the husband's away with the black men, and same thing with the with the white men. Also, uh, it talked about how the culture in Harlem and how, they had a bunch of nightclubs and stuff and restaurants, and that was usually the best place in town. Much so that the white people, of course, things were segregated at the time, but much so, white people knew, hey, the black people got the best restaurants and the best nightclubs and stuff. So the white people whom could afford it and whatnot, they would occasionally, regularly, go to the black, spots at night whenever they're, usually when their place is shut down, and then they go to the popping spots over on the black side of town, you know. So black businesses were up and running, and they were profitable, profitable enough for white people to come in, which, um, thinking about how it is today, where that dollar doesn't really circulate within the black community, but even then in the 1930s, you had white people spending money at black owned establishments. So it kind of shows that, that even then black people were, of course I was already aware of this, but it kind of showed how outside of, the Black Wall Streets and all those types of establishments that rose, it was also like even in the cities where black people were the minority, they still had competitive establishments that white people would frequent because they were the best. Even though they were nightclubs and restaurants, but I'm pretty sure elsewhere too, for suits and stuff. He talked about how he wore these clownish suits and a conch hairdo, which you can kind of see here, where he would pretty much perm his hair. Which, if you're aware of the movie, there was that scene where where the water shut off, and Denzel played Malcolm, and his hair was burning because somebody turned the water off, and he had to douse his head in the I think the commode. That was very true. That was very much true. And of course, the underground fetishes, which got pretty dark. I'm talking about like 50 Shades of Black dark. Like, yeah, like they was into some, yeah, like slave play and all that crap. Yeah, like that was a thing. You talked about the whorehouses and stuff where the Johns would frequent occasionally. He had to live there at one point actually. It was a lot. He was good. He was, of course, he was making his money. He was doing what he had to do. He had to hustle. He was well known. Like I said, he made a name for himself. He went by Detroit Red. He was known and everything. He had street cred and everything. He was a street born. He was out there. He was pretty good at what he did. You know, hustling. But I like the story of it because he constantly progresses. Because eventually he gets caught up with the white girls. This one white girl in particular, he was messing around with for some time, and he gets locked up for like a decade. I think he gets 10 years for like because he had some sort of robbing ring going on, and normally he should have been locked up for like 2 years, but because he was messing with a white girl, they slapped him with like 10 years. Him and his buddies. Um, and in prison, he eventually uh one of his brothers, I think the one that actually eventually went to the asylum, actually converted him to Islam, or well, not Islam, not traditional Islam, but the Brotherhood, and he took up under the wing, and this is where we find he becomes eventually Malcolm X as we know, as the majority of people know him as today. And he was pretty much up under the wing of whom, went by the honorable Elijah Muhammad, who had the Islamic Brotherhood here in America. And from that, you can see the progression of him and how he took those teachings and everything. Now, this is where he was fairly radical. He was not afraid to say like, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that kind of. He was not afraid of violence, even though he wasn't necessarily promoting, becoming terrorists or nothing like that. He was like, nah, if y'all come at us, we gonna come right with it too. So that he definitely had that fighting nature. Um, of course, outside of the book, they constantly would try to pit him against, like uh, Martin Luther King and them, but they each had respect for one another, because they had their different ideals and everything, but they each had their respect for one another. Malcolm did outlive Martin. I believe Martin was assassinated, um, and he talks about it in the autobiography. And eventually, unfortunately, there's some issues, and he was actually turned on by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He screws up. He makes a comment he wasn't supposed to make, and inevitably he gets turned on by the very man that he adored. I mean, he lived and breathed for the honorable Elijah Muhammad. That's what he claims in the book. And yeah, like I mean, and unfortunately, it kind of relates to how you can have so much respect for someone and only try to do right by them, but at the same time, that person might have some demons in their closet, you know, and they've always, I don't want to say manipulators, but he was. Let's just be real. Based off the book, uh, Elijah Muhammad was a very effective manipulator, and he always had an eye on Malcolm. And unfortunately, Malcolm talked about how, eventually, towards the tail end of their relationship, of course, he was established. He had a lot of influence, and he was seen as a threat because he had so much influence. And he had did something that made it seem like he was trying to do something for himself, and Elijah Muhammad did not take too kindly to it, and then eventually he had to part ways. Actually, he says that his life was threatened. So then he had to part ways, and it was from there where he was able to part ways, and he found uh, true Islam. And this is where he transitions into Mr. el-hajj Malik el-shabazz, where he's introduced to true Islam, and he does visit Mecca. Of course, he becomes well traveled during this part of his life. He travels the world. He talks to um, quite a few people, like a lot of people globally, like around the world. So now, he was already world renowned for his efforts uh, up under the Islamic Brotherhood. But when he transitioned to true Islam and he went to Mecca and everything, uh, his celebrity was kind of sought after. Like he was meeting royalty over there. He's being treated kindly. He had where originally when he was under Elijah Muhammad, he saw white people as white devils, but then under true Islam, he saw how all the races were kind of praising the same God, and they didn't see each other. Like it was it was true unison that he had realized under true Islam. And he had kind of saw a part where he realized the faults in his ways. He still didn't hold any negatives, towards the Brotherhood or anything like that. But he realized, he saw this as pretty much fate. And a lot of what went on through his life, well, it appeared that way because, eventually he gets introduced through the Islamic Brotherhood. He learns up under Elijah Muhammad. Eventually things don't go well for him there. And then he eventually ends up as a preacher, a minister of true Islam. And this is where he converts to, as he's known up until his passing, as el-hajj Malik el-shabazz. And it was at this point where, he's doing a lot of learning. Like I said, he's traveling a lot. He's meeting all these different royalty people, presidents of places in Africa. I believe he meets the wife of Marcus Garvey, because Marcus Garvey had passed away. I think this time period is around between the 1940s and 1960s, I believe. Of course, he eventually passes away. He's shot, unfortunately. He actually does allude to his potential assassination because he was aware that his father had met untimely demise, so as did his uncles and I believe his grandfather as well, by the hands of white supremacists, unfortunately. And he said, of course, he was a radical as well. He was seen as a radical as well. He was fighting the establishment, white supremacy, and he foresaw, and he was willing. He was willing to risk his life. And he was pretty much like, yeah, I'm probably going to be assassinated. I'm probably going to meet an untimely demise. But he realized he had to do what he had to do. Anyway. And he eventually, I love the story because it shows the transition from, him being the hustler in the street to being the extreme radical, to some extent, and then eventually evolving, he's constantly learning and evolving and adapting to society, and also admitting to his faults, the errors of his ways. Like if he learned something improperly, like when he transitioned after he had traveled and everything, and he was meeting all these royalties and people of true Islam, he was realizing the faults of his ways and how there was a ability to unify the races under Islam. He saw true Islam. He saw all the races, and there was actually one part where he did note in I believe when he was over there visiting Mecca or shortly after, and he noted seeing something in a crowd, which I also see from time to time when you see a group of people get together. And he noticed how the races of people, even though they were just spread out in a giant crowd of thousands and thousands of people, and he noticed how people that looked alike, like the brown people got with the brown people, the yellow people got with the yellow people, the white people got with the white people, and they were all the same race. None of them knew each other. They were just meeting each other for the same time. But he had noticed how they all kind of grouped together in their own color groups naturally, uncoerced. Like there was nobody like trying to shove. They just naturally grouped together. And he did notice that in his book, which I see very true. Where you see like when there's a group of people for a class or something, people naturally kind of group together. And he talked about how they identify with each other because they look alike, and how that is what brings them together. But in America, it's used to divide us and break us apart. Under colonization and the white supremacy system, it's used to, as a form of tribalism to break us apart instead. And I did like how he did note that in his autobiography, because that is something I do see. I have seen that since I was a child. And I found it intriguing too, like how naturally, black people got with black people, white people got with white people, even though everybody's a total stranger, but they would naturally kind of group together in their with their tribes, the guys, the people that looked alike. But I enjoyed it. I definitely learned a lot. Definitely learned that there was a lot of buffoonery going on as well back in the 1930s. That there were and will always be the dynamic that he talks about, the house Negroes and the field Negroes. There has always been a divide in the black community. And he did his best to teach, of course, get out of that slave state of mind. Let's try to do for ourselves. And that's one of the things why when he used Malcolm X, I definitely agree with that. There was nothing wrong with the separate but equal part. It was just the equal part, not the separate part. Because when black people got together, they did what they did. They built stuff. They had no problem on their own. It's just they didn't get the same resources. Like the streets weren't taken care of. They had to do things on their own. Like, you know how the county, you know, they have funding to take care of the streets and stuff. We already know they don't. Even to this day, the black neighborhoods, the majority black neighborhoods, they don't take care of them or fund them the same. That's a fact. Hello, she stole my thunder. But I did want to just talk about how I enjoyed reading and how it seemed like the evolution from Detroit Red to Malcolm X, and then inevitably how he evolves into el-hajj, Malik, el-shabazz, and unfortunately, that's where the story ends. But I did get a lot of insight from the autobiography of Malcolm X, and I definitely recommend it. Must read. It is very much a must read. Go ahead and check it out. So, till next time, guys.
お前はもう死んでいる。